Welcome back everyone to another ACE lecture. Today's lecture is going to cover skeletal system. So the functions of the skeletal system include number one, it provides a rigid framework in order to bear weight and also to support soft tissues. The skeletal system also provides protection for internal organs, like for instance the skull provides protection to the brain, while the chest wall or the ribs provide protection to the heart and the lungs. The system is also required for movements where the muscles are attached to bones via tendons, and this arrangement of muscles and bones allow for the movements of our body. Another function of the skeletal system is to act as a major reservoir for calcium and phosphate. So it acts as a storage source for calcium and phosphate, where under circumstances that the blood concentration of calcium drops, there are hormones like for instance parathyroid hormone that can act on osteoclasts to induce digestion of bone and release of calcium, as a consequence of which blood concentration of calcium will return back to the normal levels. And then finally, the bones. So the bone cavities are filled with the red bone marrow that is responsible for production of red blood cells, the other name for which is erythropoiesis. Okay, so erythropoiesis is being performed by the red bone marrow that is being stored within the cavities of the bones. Now, the next topic is cellular composition. So there are four important cells that you need to be familiar with. The first one is osteogenic cells, which are basically the stem cells that through the process of mitosis will give rise to osteoblasts. And osteoblasts are the cells that will form the bone matrix. So the bone matrix is made of a proteinaceous matrix, which is mostly made of collagen 1. So speaking of the composition of a bone, the bone is made of 70% minerals, 20% proteinaceous matrix, which is mostly made of collagen, and then 10% water. So what happens with the osteoblast laying collagen 1 is that over time this collagen will become mineralized and form bones. And then consequently, once the bone is formed around the osteoblast, these cells will turn into osteocytes, where they will develop cytoplasmic processes that will radiate from the cell body and run along the narrow canaliculi of the bone. So you can see how it now resembles a dendrite of a nerve cells because it has developed cytoplasmic projections. And the function of osteocytes is actually to control and regulate bone metabolism. So what these cells do is that they would secrete a protein called sclerostin. And the job of sclerostin is to prevent formation of new bones, so it negatively regulates bone mass. However, once there is a mechanical force that is applied to the bone, that's the time that the sclerostin secretion will decrease, as a consequence of which now there would be more bone production. And so that's why they say that weight-bearing exercises, like for instance running, that would help patients with osteoporosis because there would be reduced secretion of sclerostin, as a consequence of which now there would be more bone formation. And then the final type of cell that you should know is called osteoclast, and the function of osteoclast is to resorb bone matrix. And the reason we need to resorb bone matrix is over time there would be microfractures that will develop inside our bones. So we need to remove some of this bone matrix and replace them with a new bone. And that's the function of osteoclast. Indeed, it has been shown that patients who don't have functional osteoclasts, their bone will get thicker and thicker because this osteoclast is not there to remodel the bone. But then at the same time, even though their bones with those patients is thicker, they are also very fragile because microfractures build up over time. So osteoclast is very important for bone remodeling. In addition, by digesting bones, osteoclasts will release calcium that can help increase the blood concentration of calcium under conditions that there is a drop in calcium. So speaking of calcium homeostasis, so basically there are two important hormones that will regulate calcium concentration in the blood. The very first one is called parathyroid hormone, which has multiple mechanisms. A, it will increase osteoclast activity, as a consequence of which bone will be resorbed, and so therefore there would be more calcium that will be released into the blood. The second mechanism is by helping to form active vitamin D in the kidneys that increases calcium and phosphate reabsorption. And then finally, parathyroid hormone acts on the renal tubules to increase calcium reabsorption in distal convoluted tubules, but also increase phosphate secretion. So increase calcium reabsorption versus increase phosphate secretion in renal tubules. As a consequence of which, due to increased phosphate secretion, the overall effect of the parathyroid hormone is that it leads to increased blood concentration of calcium, but decreased blood concentration of phosphate. The next hormone that is required for homeostasis of calcium is called calcitonin. So number 2 is calcitonin, that are being produced by the parafollicular cells of the thyroid. The other name for these cells is C cells, so parafollicular or C cells of the thyroid. And the function of calcitonin is to decrease the activity of osteoclast. So if there is decreased activity of osteoclast, consequently there would be decreased bone resorption, and so therefore there would be a decreased blood concentration of calcium. So keep in mind, calcitonin will decrease blood concentration of calcium, while parathyroid hormone will increase blood concentration of calcium. Next, let's discuss different structures of bones. So there are two ways that we can discuss structure of bones. One is based on their shape, and two, based on their histology, whether they're trabecular versus compact bone. And so first, let's discuss bone structures based on their shapes. So we can have 5 different shapes. The first one is called flat bones, which are basically very thin and curved. And examples of flat bones include, like for instance, our ribs or our shoulder blade, or here in this image I'm showing a sternum, which is located right in the middle of our chest. Then we have long bones, which consist of a shaft, and these are mostly found in our upper and lower limbs. Like for instance, our arms and our legs are made of long bones. The next structure of bones is short bones, and these bones have a cube-like structure. So these have a cube-like structures and are mostly found within the wrist and ankle. The next structure of bones is irregular bone, which are found, like for instance, in the vertebrae and facial bones. So here I've shown you vertebrae and facial bones can also have irregular shapes. And then finally, we have sesamoid bones, which are developing in the tendon. And here, patella is the only sesamoid bone that we have in humans. Now, we mentioned that this classification is based on their shape. Now let's discuss about classification of bones based on their histologic structures. So based on the histologic structures, bone can fall into 2 categories. One is called compact or cortical bone, which is mostly found in the diaphysis of long bone. So if you have a long bone, the top part is epiphysis, then in the middle we have the diaphysis. So the diaphysis of long bones is made of compact or cortical bones. And these bones are made of concentric ring of extracellular matrix that is called lamella. And these lamella are being surrounded by a central canal called Haversian, or some people say Haversian canal. And the function of Haversian canal is that it houses blood vessels and nerves. So here I can show you a structure of a compact bone. So we have a compact bone on the outside of this image, and you can see that it's made of the Haversian canals that has vessels and nerves, and these central canals are being interconnected with each other by Volkmann's canals, which run perpendicular to the bone axis. Okay, so that was for the discussion of the compact bone. Next, let's discuss the spongy bone. So spongy, the other name for which is cancellous or trabecular bone. These are mainly found in the epiphysis of long bones. So here we have the epiphysis of long bones, in addition to the interior of all other bones. So here you can see in this example, the interior of this bone is made of a trabecular bone or cancellous bone, while the exterior is made of a cortical or compact bone. These spongy bones are made of interconnecting rods of bones that are called trabecula, the function of which is to add strength to the bone, but then at the same time it reduces the weight and density of the bone, because we don't want the whole thing to be made of bone, because otherwise our body would be too heavy to move around. So by having these interconnected rods of bones, which are called trabecula, there would be added strength to our bone, but then at the same time they have a relatively light weight. And then in comparison to the compact bones, these trabecular bones are highly vascularized. So these are highly vascularized and house the bone marrow, the function of which is to produce blood cells. All right, and so that concludes discussion of the trabecular or cancellous or spongy bone versus compact bone. And here I have shown you the structure of the Haversian canals and Volkmann's canal. Now, one clinical relevance I'd like to discuss here is the phenomenon of osteoporosis. Basically, this refers to the disease of brittle bones that is due to decreased bone mass that you see after age 70, or in particular in post-menopausal females, because estrogen is thought to delay osteoporosis by enhancing the activity of osteoblasts. Therefore, in postmenopausal females, once there is a decrease in estrogen, there would be increased loss of bone mass, as a consequence of which females are at increased risk of osteoporosis. And then regarding the type of bone that is mostly being affected, it's mostly the spongy bone. So the spongy bone is more affected, and so therefore osteoporotic fractures are more common in sites that have more of a spongy bone, like for instance in the hip and spine. That's why that we have very high incidence of hip fractures in elderly people that fall, because their spongy bone of the hip has undergone osteoporosis. The next concept is cartilage. And basically cartilage initially forms the human skeleton during embryonic development, and later on this cartilage is replaced by bone, and this process is called endochondral ossification. So embryo is made of a cartilage that later on will be turning into bones. Some of this cartilage, however, needs to be maintained in certain areas that we need a firm but a flexible support, okay, because cartilage has a high water content that will make it very resilient. And here I have three types of cartilage that I'm going to discuss their location and their function with you. Another feature of cartilage that I would like to discuss with you is that they have no blood vessels, as a consequence of which their nutrient supply has to be carried out via diffusion from nearby blood vessels. Okay, so no blood vessels, so nutrients are being transferred by diffusion. And then regarding different type of cartilages that we have, these include hyaline cartilage, elastic cartilage, and fibrocartilage. So let's start with the hyaline cartilage. So this type of cartilage is used to provide support and flexibility to areas such as our nose, rib cartilage, and long trachea, versus the elastic cartilage, which is required for repeated bending. Like for instance, our epiglottis, which blocks entry of food particles into our airways, is an example of an elastic cartilage. Another example of an elastic cartilage is our external ear that is capable of bending. The next type of cartilage is fibrocartilage, which is highly compressive. And this type of cartilage is found in areas that bears heavy pressures, like for instance in the menisci of the knees, or for instance in our intervertebral discs. The next two structures are tendons and ligaments. So here I would like to emphasize on the difference between these two structures. So basically a tendon is a fibrous cord of connective tissues that connects muscle to bone. And here you can see that the muscle is connected to the bone via a cartilage, versus a ligament, it's a connective tissue that helps bind bones together. So you can see that one bone is connected to another one with the help of a ligament. So a ligament allows attachment of bone to bone. Moving on to the next concept, and this is actually the final concept to discuss in this video, which is different type of joints that we have. So basically, joint, definition of joint, referred to a place where two bones come together. So two bones come in contact. And based on the composition of the connective tissues that is present or absent, joints can be classified into three types. The first one is called a fibrous joint, which binds two bones together by a fibrous tissue, and these bones have little or no movement at all. Like for instance, the bones of the skull that are being joined together is an example of a fibrous joint. Likewise, gomphosis, which binds tooth to its socket, is another example of fibrous joint. The next form of joint is the cartilaginous joint that allows a slight movements, like for instance vertebral disc, that there could be some bending but not too much. And then the next type of joint is a freely movable joints that are known as synovial joints. And the components of synovial joints include the articular cartilage, which is shown here in green. So the articular cartilage that covers the surface of the bones, the synovial cavity, which is shown here in blue color, the synovial cavity, which is filled with a synovial fluid in order to lubricate the surface of these joints. Then we have a fibrous capsule, shown here in dark blue color, the function of which is to enclose the synovial cavity. And then finally we have ligaments that form the outer layer of fibrous capsule and hold the two bones together. So again, we have three types of joints: fibrous joint, which has no or very little movement; cartilaginous joint, which has some movement; and then synovial joint, which has a lot of movement. So this is a freely movable joint. The next phenomenon that I would like to discuss is called osteoarthritis, which refers to gradual degeneration of the articular cartilage in the synovial joint. So this is degeneration of synovial cartilage. And this condition is usually seen in elderly people, particularly in those who had heavy weight in their young ages, which causes destruction of these articular joints, as a consequence of which now the two bones will come in contact with each other. And so therefore, anytime that these patients move, since bone is rubbing on bone, there would be a severe pain. So this is an example of osteoarthritis. Alright, so we are done with the discussion of this video. Next, I would like to discuss some short question and answers with you, after which I will give you some practice questions. The first question is, define metaphysis, diaphysis, and epiphysis of long bones. So we briefly touched on this topic, and we mentioned how the long bones, the outside part of it, which is made of a spongy bone, we'll call it epiphysis. This is epiphysis. The shaft of the bone is called diaphysis, which is made of a compact bone. And then finally, in between the epiphysis and diaphysis, there's a transition zone that we call metaphysis. Okay, and here we have metaphysis. And if you need a memory aid to remember from outside to inside what we have, I called it MD. So how do we pronounce MD? MD. So we have epiphysis, metaphysis, and then diaphysis. So epiphysis, metaphysis, and then diaphysis. What's the difference between exoskeleton and endoskeleton? So endoskeleton is basically referring to cartilage bones and muscle attachments that are located deep within the body, and this would allow movements via contraction of muscles. Versus exoskeleton, this refers to the outer part of the body that is seen in invertebrate animals, like for instance insects and lobsters, that will provide support and protection to their body. So this is the outer part of body in insects. And this is made of chitin, which is basically a polysaccharide. And then this structure also has protein composition. The next question is, what is a growth plate? Basically, this is a cartilaginous structure that is located on the internal part of the epiphysis, and this structure contains mitotic cells that would allow longitudinal bone growth. So the fact that we can get taller as we age, like from childhood to teenager ages, it's because of the presence of growth plate in our bones that allow our bones to get longer. The final question is, what is an osteon? And so basically each Haversian canal with the surrounding lamella and chondrocytes are referred to as osteons, the other name for which is Haversian system. So let's refer back right here. You know how we have a Haversian canal with the surrounding chondrocytes. So here we have an example of an osteon. Okay. So we are basically done with the discussion of our short questions. So next, let's go over some practice questions. The first question is, the musculoskeletal system is mostly acting as a first order lever, second order lever, third order lever, or fourth order lever. So I actually made it pretty easy for you. I've shown you the difference between first order, second order, and third order lever. The next question is, which of the following categories best describe the wrist bone? Third question is, when the blood concentration of calcium is high, the endocrine system will secrete which of the following hormones? And then which of the following tissues is or are both innervated and vascularized? So let's move on to the first question. the musculoskeletal system is mostly acting as a, and the answer is it's mostly acting as a third class lever. And the reason for that is that we have the load at the end and the force of the muscle with the tendon that is attached to the bone somewhere in between. And then the joint is at the other side, opposite side of the load. So let me show you in the image right here. So here is an example of musculoskeletal system. We can see that we have the joint at one side, then there is the muscle effort in the middle, and then the weight bearing, so here holding with the hand some sort of weight, so let's say there is a dumbbell that this person is holding, is at the end of the spectrum. Okay, so the musculoskeletal system is mostly acting as a third order lever. Now let's recall, what was first order lever? It's when having the turning point between the load and the force, versus the second order lever is when the load is located in between. And so actually we do have some parts of our musculoskeletal system acting as a second order lever, like for instance our ankle joint, where here we have the bone and then there is the muscle that is attached to the bone right here. So the effort is upward while the load is downward, and then the turning point is right at the tip of the foot. So here we have the turning point, the load is right in the middle, and then the effort is at the end of the spectrum. So ankle joint is an example of a second order lever, but most of our musculoskeletal system is acting as a third order lever, which is shown right here. Turning point at one side and then the load on the other side, with having the force or effort right in the middle. Moving on to the next question, which of the following categories best describes the wrist bones? So let's go back to the images that we have here. So we just discussed that a wrist bone is an example of a short bone, which is cube-like. So here we have an example of short bone. The next question is, when the blood concentration of calcium is high, the endocrine secretes. So we just discussed how parathyroid hormone increases calcium concentration of blood, while calcitonin decreases blood concentration of calcium. Therefore, when the blood concentration of calcium is too high, calcitonin will be released. So the endocrine system secretes calcitonin in order to decrease the function of osteoclasts. So by decreasing the function of osteoclasts, there would be reduction in blood calcium. And then the final question asks, which of the following tissues is both innervated and vascularized? And the answer would be bone. It's both innervated and vascularized, while the cartilage doesn't have any vascular supply or any nerves. So that concludes our discussion of this video. I would like to thank you all for listening, and we will see you for the next video.